The lone cry pierced the vast emptiness of the Dakota Territory prairie like a knife, carrying across the wind-swept grass with a desperation that made Wyatt Harmon pull hard on his horse's reins. The seasoned cowboy had heard many sounds during his years on the frontier: the howl of wolves, the war cries of Lakota warriors, the deadly rattle of a snake, but nothing quite like the wail that reached his ears on this sweltering July afternoon in 1876. Wyatt tilted his wide-brimmed hat back on his head, squinting against the harsh sunlight. His weathered face, tanned from years under the open sky, creased with concern as he listened. The sound came again, unmistakably the cry of an infant. He turned his horse, a sturdy buckskin gelding named Copper, toward the source of the sound, a slight depression in the rolling grassland about 50 yards to his left. As he approached, the tall prairie grass parted to reveal a sight that made his heart clench. A young woman lay motionless on her side, one arm still protectively curled around a small bundle, a baby wrapped in a thin, soiled blanket. The infant's face was red from crying, tiny fists waving in distress. Beside them lay a small carpet bag, its contents spilled onto the ground. Wyatt dismounted quickly, his spurs jingling as his boots hit the hard-packed earth. He approached cautiously, his hand hovering near the Colt revolver at his hip, a habit born from years of frontier vigilance. "Madam," he called out, his deep voice gentle despite its natural gruffness. The woman didn't move. Her dress, once a cheerful blue calico, was travel-stained and torn. Her face was partially hidden by strands of light brown hair that had escaped from a simple braid. Wyatt knelt beside her, noting with relief the shallow rise and fall of her chest. She was alive, but clearly unconscious. The baby continued to cry, the sound growing weaker by the moment. Wyatt recognized the particular quality of that cry: hunger. He'd heard it enough times on cattle drives when they'd come across settler families in desperate straits. Without hesitation, Wyatt shrugged off his worn leather coat, spreading it on the ground. Gently, he lifted the baby, noting how light the child felt in his large, calloused hands. The infant couldn't have been more than a few months old. "Hey there, little one," he murmured, awkwardly cradling the baby in one arm while checking on the mother with his free hand. She was burning with fever. Wyatt's mind raced. The nearest town, Clearwater, was at least 15 miles away. The woman needed a doctor and the baby needed food. Looking around, he saw no sign of a wagon or horse. How had they come to be here? Alone in the middle of nowhere, the baby's cries were growing weaker, which worried Wyatt more than the louder wails. Carefully, he wrapped the child in his coat and placed the bundle in the crook of his arm. Then, with strength born from years of hard ranch work, he lifted the unconscious woman and managed to position her across Copper's back. The horse snorted but stood steady, trained to handle far heavier loads of cattle. "Steady, boy," Wyatt murmured, gathering the reins in his free hand. With the baby secured in one arm and leading his horse with the other, he began the long walk toward Clearwater. The July sun beat down mercilessly as Wyatt trudged through the grass, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon for any sign of threat. This territory could be dangerous outlaws, hostile Indians, wild animals, but his immediate concern was for the two vulnerable lives now in his care. After what seemed like hours, the baby's cries subsided into whimpers, then silence. Alarmed, Wyatt stopped to check on the child. The infant's eyes were open, revealing a startling shade of blue that reminded him of the Montana sky. Despite the hunger and discomfort, the baby wasn't crying anymore, just staring up at Wyatt with a gaze that seemed far too knowing for one so young. "Hang on, little one," he whispered. "We'll get you some help soon." The woman on the horse moaned softly, her eyes fluttering open for a brief moment before closing again. At least she was still alive. Wyatt quickened his pace as much as he dared in the afternoon heat. By the time the first buildings of Clearwater came into view, the sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon. Wyatt's shirt was soaked with sweat, his muscles aching from the unusual burden. He headed straight for Doc Harrison's place at the edge of town, ignoring the curious stares of the townspeople who stopped to watch the unusual procession. The doctor's house, a modest two-story structure with a sign announcing Dr. James Harrison, physician and surgeon, stood apart from the main street. Wyatt managed to knock on the door with his boot, unwilling to release either of his precious charges. The door swung open to reveal a middle-aged man with spectacles and a neatly trimmed beard. "Wyatt Harmon," the doctor exclaimed, taking in the scene before him. "What in heaven's name found them out on the prairie?" Wyatt explained tersely. "The woman's burning up with fever and the baby's starving. Can you help? Bring them in quickly, doctor." Harrison stepped aside, holding the door wide. Inside, the doctor's wife, Martha, appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. Her eyes widened at the sight. "Martha, we need milk for this infant, immediately," the doctor ordered as he helped Wyatt lower the unconscious woman onto an examination table in the front room that served as his office. "I'll warm some cow's milk with a bit of sugar," Martha replied, already moving toward the kitchen. "Poor little mite. Let me take the baby," she added, returning quickly and holding out her arms. Wyatt hesitated for a moment, suddenly reluctant to release the small bundle he'd carried so far. Martha smiled gently. "I've raised 5 children of my own, Mr. Harmon. This little one will be safe with me." Nodding, Wyatt carefully transferred the baby to her capable hands. The infant made a small sound of protest, but then settled against Martha's ample bosom. While Martha tended to the baby, Dr. Harrison was examining the woman. "She's severely dehydrated and running a high fever," he reported. "Likely influenza, though I can't rule out other ailments yet. She'll need constant care for at least several days. Will she make it, Doc?" Wyatt asked, his voice rough with concern for this stranger who had somehow become his responsibility. The doctor looked up, his expression grave. "I won't lie to you, Wyatt. Her condition is serious, but she's young and appears to have been healthy before this. With proper care, she has a good chance." Wyatt nodded, removing his hat and running a hand through his sweat-dampened hair. "Any idea who she might be? I didn't see any identification among her things." "No, but that's not unusual for folks passing through. Many come west with little more than the clothes on their backs and whatever they can carry." The doctor began preparing a tincture from bottles on a nearby shelf. "Martha and I can take them in for now, but our house is already full with my sister and her children visiting from St. Louis." Wyatt knew what was coming next. "I'll check with Mrs. Landry at the boarding house," he offered. "She might have a room available." "That would be helpful, but they'll need more than just a roof over their heads," Dr. Harrison said, giving Wyatt a meaningful look. "The woman won't be able to care for herself or the child for some time, and without knowing if she has family or friends coming after her." The unspoken question hung in the air between them. Wyatt shifted uncomfortably. He was a solitary man by nature and circumstance, having spent most of his 32 years moving from ranch to ranch, never staying in one place long enough to form lasting connections. The small cabin he currently occupied on the edge of the Rocking H Ranch where he worked was barely suitable for one person, let alone a woman and a baby. Before he could respond, Martha returned with the infant, who was now sucking eagerly at a makeshift bottle fashioned from a small medicine vial fitted with a piece of clean cloth. "She's a hungry little thing," Martha said, smiling down at the baby. "And a girl, by the way." "No more than 3 months old, I'd say." "And her mother?" Wyatt asked, looking at the pale face of the young woman on the examination table. "We won't know anything more until she wakes up," Dr. Harrison replied. "For now, we need to focus on bringing down her fever and keeping her hydrated." Wyatt nodded, knowing he couldn't simply walk away. "I'll talk to Mrs. Landry about a room, and then I need to let Mr. Henderson know what's happened. I was supposed to be back at the ranch hours ago." He hesitated, then added, "I can check in tomorrow to see how they're doing, Doctor." Harrison nodded, understanding the cowboy's reluctance to become too involved. "That would be appreciated, Wyatt, and thank you for bringing them in. Many men might have ridden on past." The thought had never even occurred to Wyatt. He nodded curtly, settled his hat back on his head, and headed for the door. Before leaving, he cast one last glance at the woman and child. Something twisted in his chest at the sight, something unfamiliar and uncomfortable, that he chose not to examine too closely. Outside, he untied Copper from the hitching post and led him toward the boarding house, his mind filled with thoughts of the woman with light brown hair and the baby with sky-blue eyes. Who were they? Where had they come from? And why were they alone on the prairie, miles from anywhere? The answers would have to wait. For now, all he could do was ensure they had a safe place to recover. Tomorrow would be soon enough to figure out the rest. Mrs. Landry, a widow who ran the town's only boarding house, was initially hesitant about taking in an ill woman and an infant. "I run a respectable establishment, Mr. Harmon," she said, peering at him over her spectacles. "My guests expect peace and quiet." "I understand, madam," Wyatt replied, trying to keep his frustration in check. "But these folks have nowhere else to go. The woman's sick and the baby needs shelter. I'll cover the cost of the room for a week, up front." The mention of guaranteed payment softened Mrs. Landry's expression. "Well, I do have the small room at the back of the house. It's further from the other guests, so any disturbances would be minimized." "That would be perfect," Wyatt said, reaching for his wallet. He counted out the required amount, adding a little extra. "I'd also appreciate if you could find someone to help care for them until the woman's back on her feet. I'll cover those costs as well, Mrs." Landry's eyebrows rose slightly at his generosity. "Molly Jenkins has been looking for work since the laundry closed. She's good with children, has 4 of her own. I can send my boy to fetch her." "Thank you," Wyatt said, relieved that at least this part of the problem was being solved. "I'll let Doc Harrison know the arrangements." After ensuring everything was set at the boarding house, Wyatt finally mounted Copper and headed back to the Rocking H Ranch. The sun was setting, painting the prairie in hues of gold and crimson. Normally, he would have appreciated the spectacular view, but tonight his mind was elsewhere. Mr. Henderson, the ranch owner, was understanding about Wyatt's delayed return once he explained the circumstances. "You did right by those folks, Wyatt," the older man said, puffing on his pipe as they stood outside the main house. "Not many would have stopped to help." "Couldn't just leave them there," Wyatt mumbled, uncomfortable with the praise. "No, I suppose you couldn't," Henderson agreed. "That's why you're my best hand. You've got a good heart under all that gruffness." He tapped his pipe against the porch rail. "Take tomorrow morning off if you need to check on them. Wilson and Martinez can cover your duties." Wyatt nodded his thanks and retreated to his cabin, a simple one-room structure with a bed, a table, 2 chairs, and a small stove. It wasn't much, but it was more of a home than he'd had in years. As he prepared a simple meal of beans and bacon, his thoughts kept returning to the woman and child he'd rescued. Something about their vulnerability had stirred feelings he'd long thought buried, protective instincts he hadn't experienced since losing his family in a cholera outbreak 15 years earlier. At 17, he'd been the sole survivor when the disease swept through their small Kansas farm. Unable to bear the memories, he'd headed west, working his way through ranches in Colorado, Wyoming, and now Dakota Territory. As he lay in his narrow bed that night, staring at the rough-hewn ceiling, Wyatt wondered what would become of the young mother and her baby. He told himself his responsibility ended with ensuring they had shelter and care. Yet something deeper told him their paths were now intertwined in ways he couldn't yet understand. Morning found Wyatt heading back to town, earlier than necessary. He told himself he was just fulfilling his obligation to check on the strangers he'd rescued, but the knot of anticipation in his stomach suggested otherwise. His first stop was Doc Harrison's house, where he learned that the woman had been moved to Mrs. Landry's boarding house late the previous evening. Her fever broke during the night, the doctor explained. She's still weak but conscious. Hasn't said much yet, seems confused about where she is. Did she tell you her name? Wyatt asked. Lillian Montgomery. That's all we could get from her before she fell asleep again. The doctor adjusted his spectacles. The baby seems to be doing well, though. Martha was reluctant to let her go, I'll tell you that. Wyatt nodded, oddly pleased to have names for the pair who had occupied his thoughts. Lillian and... He realized he didn't know the baby's name. She didn't say, and we didn't press her. There'll be time enough for questions when she's stronger. The doctor gave Wyatt a knowing look. You're heading over there now, I take it. Just want to make sure they're settled in properly, Wyatt said defensively. Of course, Dr. Harrison replied, not bothering to hide his smile. Give Mrs. Landry my regards. The boarding house was a well-maintained two-story building on a quiet side street. Mrs. Landry met Wyatt at the door, informing him that Molly Jenkins had arrived early that morning and was now tending to both mother and child. The poor woman's still very weak, Mrs. Landry whispered as she led Wyatt down a narrow hallway to the back room. Barely touched the broth I brought her. But the baby took to Molly right away, thank goodness. She knocked softly on the door, then opened it without waiting for a response. Mrs. Montgomery, you have a visitor, the gentleman who found you yesterday. The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a rocking chair, and a small table. Sunlight streamed through lace curtains, illuminating the pale figure propped up against several pillows. Lillian Montgomery looked younger than Wyatt had initially thought, perhaps early 20s. Her face, though drawn with exhaustion, showed delicate features and a gentle mouth. Her hair, now neatly brushed and braided, was a rich chestnut brown that gleamed in the sunlight. But it was her eyes that caught and held Wyatt's attention, the same startling blue as her daughter's, now filled with a mixture of wariness and gratitude. A plump, motherly woman whom Wyatt assumed was Molly Jenkins sat in the rocking chair, the baby cradled in her arms. Mr. Harmon, Mrs. Landry said formally, may I present Mrs. Lillian Montgomery? Mrs. Montgomery, this is Wyatt Harmon, the man who brought you and your daughter to town. Lillian's eyes met Wyatt's, and she attempted a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I'm told I owe you my life, Mr. Harmon, and Emma's. Her voice was soft, with a slight Eastern accent that marked her as not from these parts. Emma, Wyatt repeated, glancing at the baby. That's a pretty name. After my grandmother, Lillian explained, then fell silent, seemingly exhausted by even this small conversation. I was just passing by, Wyatt said awkwardly, his hat in his hands. Anyone would have done the same. Not anyone, Lillian replied quietly. Thank you. An uncomfortable silence fell. Wyatt shifted his weight, suddenly aware of his dusty clothes and unshaven face. He hadn't planned what to say beyond checking on their welfare. Mrs. Landry came to his rescue. Mr. Harmon has generously arranged for your room and for Molly's assistance until you're back on your feet, she explained to Lillian. Isn't that kind of him? Lillian's eyes widened slightly. I don't know how I can repay such generosity, Mr. Harmon. I don't have much. No need to worry about that now, Wyatt interrupted, uncomfortable with her gratitude. Just focus on getting well, for both your sakes. He nodded toward Emma, who was contentedly sleeping in Molly's arms. Doctor. Harrison says she should stay in bed for at least 3 more days, Molly added, speaking for the first time. The fever took a lot out of her. Wyatt nodded. I'll check back in a few days then, if you need anything in the meantime. You've done more than enough, Mr. Harmon, Lillian said, her voice barely above a whisper. I won't forget it. With a nod and a mumbled goodbye, Wyatt retreated from the room, strangely affected by the encounter. Mrs. Landry followed him to the front door. She seems like a respectable young woman, she commented. Though traveling alone with an infant, one has to wonder. Wyatt bristled at the implied judgment. She was wearing a wedding ring, he pointed out, though he hadn't consciously noticed this detail until now. And she introduced the baby as her daughter. That's all that matters, Mrs. Landry raised her eyebrows at his defensive tone, but wisely said nothing more on the subject. Will you be returning soon, then? In a few days, Wyatt confirmed. Please send word to the Rocking H if there's any change in their condition. As he rode back to the ranch, Wyatt found himself pondering the mystery of Lillian Montgomery. What was a young Eastern woman doing alone on the Dakota prairie with an infant? Where was her husband? And why did he feel so drawn to her vulnerability and quiet dignity? These questions would have to wait. For now, he had cattle to tend and fences to mend. But even as he threw himself into his work over the next few days, the image of blue eyes in a pale face continued to haunt him. 3 days later, Wyatt returned to Clearwater. This time, he made an effort to clean up before his visit, shaving carefully and donning his least worn shirt. He told himself it was simply a matter of respect, but the knowing grin Wilson gave him as he left the ranch suggested his colleague saw through the pretense. Mrs. Landry greeted him with more warmth than on his previous visits. Mrs. Montgomery is doing much better today, she informed him. She even managed to come downstairs for breakfast this morning, though she tired quickly and returned to her room. When Wyatt was shown into Lillian's room, he was pleased to see her sitting up in a chair by the window, Emma cradled in her arms. Color had returned to her cheeks, and her hair was arranged more carefully, with small tendrils framing her face. She wore a simple dress that Mrs. Landry had likely loaned her, as her own clothes had been in poor condition. Mr. Harmon, she greeted him, her voice stronger than before. How kind of you to visit again. Madam, he replied, nodding, you're looking better. Thanks to your generosity and the care of Mrs. Landry and Molly. She glanced down at Emma, who was awake and making soft cooing sounds. And Dr. Harrison, of course. Everyone has been so kind. Wyatt took the chair Mrs. Landry offered before discreetly leaving them alone. I'm glad to see you recovering. The little one seems to be thriving as well. A genuine smile lit Lillian's face as she gazed at her daughter. Yes, she's a strong baby. Dr. Harrison says she's perfectly healthy, just needed proper feeding. The smile faded slightly. I couldn't provide for her properly, before you found us, I mean. Wyatt shifted uncomfortably, sensing the shame beneath her words. No one could in your situation, being stranded on the prairie with no supplies. He hesitated, then ventured the question that had been bothering him. If you don't mind my asking, Mrs. Montgomery, how did you come to be there? Alone, Lillian's expression closed, her eyes dropping to focus on Emma. It's complicated, Mr. Harmon. I understand if you'd rather not discuss it, Wyatt said quickly. I was just concerned that someone might be looking for you, a husband perhaps. Her hand tightened slightly on the baby's blanket. No, she said softly. No one is looking for us. The finality in her tone discouraged further questions on that subject. Wyatt changed tack. Dr. Harrison says you're from back east. Philadelphia, she confirmed, seeming relieved at the shift in conversation. Though I've been traveling westward for several months now. That's a long journey, especially with a young one. Yes. Her eyes met his briefly before skittering away. Mr. Harmon, I need to be honest with you. I have no way to repay you for your kindness, not immediately, at least. My funds are limited. Wyatt waved away her concern. I didn't help you expecting payment, Mrs. Montgomery. Lillian, please, she corrected gently. And I understand that, but I can't accept charity indefinitely. As soon as I'm strong enough, I intend to find work. Wyatt frowned. Work, with a baby to care for. I don't have much choice, she replied with quiet dignity. I'm trained as a teacher, but I'm willing to do whatever is available. Sewing, laundry, cooking. Clearwater's a small town, Wyatt cautioned. Work can be hard to come by, especially for a woman with a child and no connections. He'd been about to say husband, but caught himself in time. Nevertheless, I must try. Her chin lifted slightly in determination. I won't be a burden on your generosity or anyone else's. Wyatt admired her spirit even as he worried about the practicality of her plan. A young, unmarried woman, for he was increasingly certain she was not a widow, as she implied with a baby, would find few respectable employment opportunities in a frontier town. Let's not worry about that just yet, he suggested. You need to regain your strength first. Have you spoken with Dr. Harrison about how long that might take? He says another week of rest should see me fully recovered, she replied. Mrs. Landry has kindly agreed I can stay until then, thanks to your arrangement. The conversation drifted to safer topics, the unusually mild weather they'd been having, the upcoming Founders' Day celebration in Clearwater, Emma's apparent fascination with the colorful quilt on the bed. Wyatt found himself relaxing in Lillian's company, drawn to her quiet intelligence and the gentle way she handled her daughter. As he prepared to leave, promising to return in a few days, Lillian stopped him with a soft question. Mr. Harmon, Wyatt, may I ask why you're doing all this? For strangers, I mean. The question caught him off guard. He considered several responses before settling on the truth. When I was 17, my family died of cholera. Parents, 2 younger sisters. Neighbors helped me through it, though there wasn't much they could do except offer a place to stay until I found my feet. He met her gaze steadily. I guess I'm just returning the favor. Lillian's eyes softened with compassion. I'm so sorry for your loss. Wyatt nodded, uncomfortable with her sympathy. It was a long time ago. I should be going now. The ranch hands will be wondering where I've disappeared to. Of course. Thank you for visiting. Her smile was warm, transforming her face from merely pretty to truly beautiful. Emma and I look forward to your next visit. As Wyatt rode back to the ranch, he found himself smiling without quite knowing why. The mystery surrounding Lillian Montgomery remained, but he was increasingly certain that whatever her past held, she was a woman of character and courage. And that, he reflected, was becoming dangerously appealing. Over the next 2 weeks, Wyatt's visits to the boarding house became a regular occurrence. He found excuses to go into town, supplies needed for the ranch, messages to deliver, errands that conveniently took him past Mrs. Landry's establishment. Each time he was welcomed with increasing warmth by both Lillian and Emma. The baby, now thriving under proper care, had developed a particular fascination with Wyatt's hat. Her tiny hands would reach for it whenever he came near, and her face would light up with a gummy smile that never failed to warm his heart. Lillian, too, blossomed as her health returned. Her natural beauty, enhanced by restored vigor, drew admiring glances from townsmen when she ventured out for short walks with Emma. Mrs. Landry had loaned her some suitable clothing, and someone Wyatt suspected Martha Harrison had provided a few simple toys and garments for the baby. Their conversations grew longer and more personal with each visit. Wyatt found himself sharing stories of his years on various ranches, his travels through the Western Territories, even memories of his family that he'd rarely spoken of to anyone. In return, Lillian told him about growing up in Philadelphia, her love of books and teaching, and her dreams of someday having her own school. What she didn't speak of was Emma's father, or the circumstances that had brought her west. Whenever the conversation veered in that direction, she would gently but firmly change the subject. Wyatt respected her privacy, though his curiosity remained. As the end of the third week approached, the issue of Lillian's future could no longer be avoided. The money Wyatt had paid for her room and care was running out, and despite her improved health, her prospects for employment in Clearwater remained limited. Mrs. Landry mentioned that the widow Peterson is looking for help with her boarding house in Riverton, Lillian mentioned during one of Wyatt's visits. They were sitting on the small porch behind the boarding house, enjoying the late afternoon sunshine. Emma was asleep in a makeshift cradle fashioned from a drawer lined with blankets. Wyatt frowned. Riverton's nearly 30 miles from here. Yes, but Mrs. Peterson apparently doesn't mind that I have Emma. She has grandchildren of her own and misses having little ones around. Lillian's fingers nervously pleated the fabric of her borrowed dress. The position includes room and board for both of us, plus a small wage. When would you leave? Wyatt asked, trying to keep his voice neutral despite the sudden hollowness in his chest. There's a freight wagon heading that way the day after tomorrow. The driver said he could take us. Lillian glanced at him, then quickly away. It seems like the best opportunity I'm likely to find. Wyatt stared at the horizon, where thunderheads were beginning to build. It's not safe, traveling with a driver you don't know. The road to Riverton goes through some rough country. I don't have many options, Wyatt, Lillian said softly. I can't impose on your generosity forever, and there's no work for me here in Clearwater. The unspoken question hung between them. Unless there was a reason for her to stay, Wyatt had been wrestling with his growing feelings for Lillian and Emma. He'd never been a man to act impulsively, especially when it came to personal matters. His solitary lifestyle suited him, or so he'd always believed. The idea of responsibility for a woman and child both terrified and strangely appealed to him, but there were too many unanswered questions. He turned to face her directly. Lillian, before you make any decisions, I need to know the truth. About Emma's father, about why you were alone on the prairie. She tensed, her eyes dropping to her hands. Does it matter? It might, he answered honestly. Not because I'm judging you, but because I can't help properly if I don't know what you're running from. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant rumble of thunder and Emma's soft breathing. Finally, Lillian raised her eyes to his. I was married, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. His name was Charles Montgomery. He was a banker's son in Philadelphia, charming and well-respected. My father was delighted when he asked for my hand. She paused, gathering her thoughts. After the wedding, things changed. Charles had a temper, especially when he drank, which was often. At first it was just harsh words, then controlling behavior who I could see where I could go. Eventually it became physical. Wyatt's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, letting her continue at her own pace. When I discovered I was expecting Emma, I hoped things would improve. They didn't. If anything, Charles became more volatile, resentful of the attention I gave to my pregnancy. Her hand moved protectively to the cradle where Emma slept. After she was born, I feared for her safety as well as my own. One night when Charles was particularly violent, I knew we had to leave. You ran, Wyatt supplied softly. Lillian nodded. I took what little money I had saved, some clothing, and Emma. We traveled west by train as far as my funds would allow, then by stagecoach, and finally with a wagon train of settlers. I hoped to reach California, where I have a distant cousin. What happened to separate you from the wagon train? Her eyes clouded with the memory. There was a man, one of the other travelers. He discovered I was running from my husband and threatened to send word back east for a reward. When I refused his advances, he told the wagon master I was a thief. They left us at the next settlement with just our few belongings. And from there, I hired a local man to take us to the next town, but his wagon broke down. He went to get help, promising to return. Her bitter laugh held no humor. He never came back. Emma and I walked as far as we could before I became ill. The last thing I remember before you found us was trying to find shelter from the sun for Emma in the tall grass. Wyatt absorbed her story, anger building at the men who had failed and abused this woman and her innocent child. Your husband, is he looking for you? I don't know, Lillian admitted. He might be, for pride's sake if nothing else, or he may have decided we weren't worth the trouble. And if he finds you, her eyes met his, fear mingling with determination. He won't take Emma. I won't allow it. Wyatt nodded slowly, understanding the steel beneath her gentle exterior. Thank you for telling me the truth. Does it change things? She asked, vulnerability evident in her voice. Yes, he said simply. It changes everything. Before he could elaborate, Emma stirred and began to fuss. Lillian immediately reached for her daughter, lifting her with practiced ease. She's hungry, she explained, adjusting her position to feed the baby discreetly. Wyatt stood, giving them privacy. I need to get back to the ranch before that storm hits, he said, glancing at the darkening sky. But I'd like to talk more tomorrow if that's all right. Lillian looked up at him, uncertainty in her blue eyes. Of course. We're not leaving until the day after tomorrow. Don't make any final decisions until we've talked, Wyatt urged. Please. She nodded, though doubt lingered in her expression. Until tomorrow, then. Wyatt rode back to the rocking H with his mind in turmoil. Lillian's story had confirmed his suspicions, but also awakened a protective instinct stronger than any he'd felt before. The thought of her and Emma traveling to Riverton with a strange freight driver, then working for an unknown widow, filled him with dread. But what alternative could he offer? His cabin was too small for three, and while he had steady employment with the Rocking H, his position as a ranch hand hardly provided the security a woman and child needed. The logical solution seemed clear, yet he hesitated to propose it, uncertain of his own motivations and Lillian's potential response. That night, as the promised storm raged outside his cabin, Wyatt made his decision. It might not be the perfect solution, but it was better than watching Lillian and Emma disappear from his life, potentially into greater danger. Morning brought clear skies and renewed determination. Wyatt sought out Mr. Henderson before the day's work began, requesting a private conversation. The ranch owner listened carefully to Wyatt's abbreviated version of Lillian's situation and his proposed solution. Marriage, Wyatt. Henderson raised his bushy eyebrows. That's a serious step for a man who's avoided putting down roots for 15 years. I know it sounds sudden, Wyatt acknowledged, but I can't let them go to Riverton alone. It's not safe and they have no one else. And your feelings for Mrs. Montgomery? Henderson asked shrewdly. Are they simply protective or something more? Wyatt shifted uncomfortably. I respect her. I admire her courage and devotion to her child. The rest might come with time, Henderson sighed. Not the most romantic proposal I've ever heard, but practical, I suppose. He studied Wyatt for a long moment. The foreman's cabin has been empty since Jenkins moved to town with his wife. It's bigger than yours, 2 rooms at least. If you're serious about this, it's yours. Relief flooded through Wyatt. Thank you, sir. I'll work extra shifts to cover the difference in pay. No need, Henderson waved away the offer. Jenkins was overpaid anyway. Just make sure you know what you're doing, Wyatt. Marriage isn't a cattle drive you can't just ride away when the season's over. I understand that, Wyatt assured him, though his stomach nodded at the permanence of what he was proposing. Then go with my blessing, Henderson said. And bring your new family to Sunday dinner so Mrs. Henderson can fuss over them properly. Wyatt rode into Clearwater with a mixture of determination and apprehension. He'd stopped at the general store to purchase something he thought necessary for his proposal, though the knowing smile of the shopkeeper had nearly made him abandon the gesture as too sentimental. At the boarding house, he found Lillian in her room, packing her meager belongings into the carpetbag he'd recovered from the prairie. Emma lay on the bed, kicking her feet and gurgling at a piece of colorful ribbon dangling above her. You're still planning to leave, Wyatt said, unable to keep the disappointment from his voice. Lillian looked up, her expression a mixture of resignation and regret. I have to, Wyatt. The freight wagon leaves at noon tomorrow. What if there was another option? He stepped further into the room, his hat in his hands and his heart in his throat. What other option could there be? Lillian asked softly. I've asked everywhere in town. No one needs a teacher, especially one with a baby. Wyatt took a deep breath. You could marry me. Lillian froze, her eyes widening in shock. What? It's not as crazy as it sounds, Wyatt continued hurriedly. I have a good position at the Rocking H, and Mr. Henderson has offered us the foreman's cabin. It's twice the size of mine, with an actual bedroom. You and Emma would be safe, and in time, perhaps you could start a small school for the ranch children and others nearby. Lillian sank slowly onto the edge of the bed. Wyatt, I don't know what to say. This is so unexpected. I know it's sudden, he admitted. And I know we haven't known each other long. But I care about you and Emma. I want to protect you both, give you a safe home. Protection and safety are important, Lillian said carefully, but marriage should be more than that. After my experience with Charles, I swore I'd never again enter a marriage without. She trailed off, color rising in her cheeks. Without love, Wyatt finished for her. He knelt before her, taking her hands in his. I can't promise I love you yet, Lillian. I've spent too many years keeping people at a distance to know exactly what I feel. But I know I want you and Emma in my life. I know the thought of you leaving makes me feel hollow inside. Maybe that's the beginning of love. Maybe with time it could grow into something more. Tears welled in Lillian's eyes. You're a good man, Wyatt Harmon. Better than I deserve after the mess I've made of my life. You deserve happiness and security, Wyatt insisted. I want to provide that if you'll let me. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small package wrapped in brown paper. I bought this. It's not fancy, but Lillian unwrapped the package to reveal a simple silver band. A ring, she whispered. If you accept, Wyatt clarified. If not, I understand. The offer of help still stands. I can arrange safer transportation to Riverton, or somewhere else if you prefer. Lillian looked from the ring to Wyatt's earnest face, then to Emma, who had rolled onto her side and was watching them with curious blue eyes. What about Emma? She's not your child. She would be in every way that matters, Wyatt said firmly. I'd raise her as my own, give her my name. And if Charles ever finds us, Wyatt's expression hardened. He'd have to go through me to get to either of you, and I promise you, Lillian, that wouldn't end well for him. The fierce protectiveness in his voice seemed to reassure her. She studied his face for a long moment, then slowly nodded. "Yes," she said softly. "I accept your proposal, Wyatt." Relief and an unexpected surge of joy flooded through him. He slipped the ring onto her finger, where it sat a little loosely but gleamed with promise in the afternoon light. "We can be married tomorrow," he suggested. "Reverend Thomas would do it, I'm sure. And then I can take you and Emma home to the ranch." "Home," Lillian repeated, testing the word. "That sounds wonderful." Wyatt smiled, then, impulsively, leaned forward to place a gentle kiss on her forehead. "I'll do my best to make it so for both of you." The wedding took place the following morning in Clearwater's small church. The ceremony was simple, attended only by Dr. and Mrs. Harrison, Mrs. Landry, and Mr. Henderson, who had ridden in from the ranch to show his support. Lillian wore a borrowed blue dress from Martha Harrison, with Emma in her arms, dressed in a new white gown that the women of the town had quickly sewn as a gift. Wyatt, in his best shirt and cleanly shaven, felt a strange combination of terror and contentment as he repeated his vows. When Reverend Thomas pronounced them husband and wife, he hesitated only briefly before placing a chaste kiss on Lillian's lips there first. The touch sent an unexpected warmth through him, a promise of feelings that might deepen with time. After a small celebration at the boarding house, Wyatt loaded Lillian and Emma's few possessions onto Copper. Mr. Henderson had thoughtfully brought a wagon to transport the new family back to the ranch, along with a rocking chair that Mrs. Henderson insisted was essential for a mother with a young baby. The ride to the rocking H was quiet, with Emma sleeping peacefully in Lillian's arms and both adults lost in thoughts about the significant step they had just taken. As they approached the ranch, Wyatt pointed out landmarks: the creek where the cattle watered, the stand of cottonwoods that marked the property line, the distant mountains that turned purple in the evening light. "It's beautiful," Lillian said sincerely. "So open and free." "It can be harsh, too," Wyatt cautioned. "Winters are brutal, and summer storms can appear out of nowhere. But there's a peace here I've never found anywhere else." The foreman's cabin stood apart from the main ranch house and bunkhouse, offering privacy while still being close enough for convenience. It was rustic but solidly built, with a front porch, 2 rooms inside, and a small lean-to that served as a kitchen. Wyatt had spent the previous evening cleaning it as best he could, though he worried it would still seem primitive to a woman raised in Philadelphia. As he helped Lillian down from the wagon, Emma still cradled in one arm, he felt a sudden uncertainty. "It's not much," he began apologetically. Lillian surprised him by reaching up to touch his cheek gently. "It's more than enough, Wyatt. It's a home." Her smile was genuine, warming him more effectively than any fire could have. Mr. Henderson helped unload their few possessions and set up the rocking chair in a corner of the main room before tactfully departing, leaving the new family to settle in. The awkwardness Wyatt had feared didn't materialize as they worked together to arrange the cabin, Lillian placing Emma on a blanket on the bed while she unpacked, Wyatt showing her where everything was kept. As evening approached, Wyatt built a fire in the stove and prepared a simple meal from the provisions Mrs. Henderson had sent with them. They ate at the small table, Emma now asleep in a drawer lined with blankets that served as a temporary cradle. "Tomorrow I'll build a proper crib for her," Wyatt promised, watching the baby's peaceful face in the lamplight. "She seems content enough for now," Lillian observed. "Children are adaptable more so than adults sometimes." "And you?" Wyatt asked hesitantly. "Are you content with this arrangement?" Lillian considered the question thoughtfully. I'm grateful, certainly, relieved to have security for Emma, and— she hesitated, a slight blush coloring her cheeks. I find I'm looking forward to building a life here with you. Her candor touched him deeply. I want to be a good husband to you, Lillian, a good father to Emma. I may not always know how, but I promise to try. That's all anyone can ask, she replied softly, and I promise to be patient as we figure this out together. The mention of together brought to mind the sleeping arrangements, a subject Wyatt had been carefully avoiding thinking about. There was only one bed in the cabin, narrow but adequate for two. As if reading his thoughts, Lillian's blush deepened. I can sleep on the floor tonight, Wyatt offered quickly, until we have time to make other arrangements. Lillian's eyes met his, uncertainty mingling with something else, trust, perhaps. That's not necessary, Wyatt. We're married now, but perhaps we could. Take things slowly. Relief and disappointment warred within him. Of course, he agreed, however you're comfortable. Later, as they lay side by side in the narrow bed, Emma sleeping peacefully in her makeshift cradle nearby, Wyatt was acutely aware of Lillian's presence, the faint scent of lavender soap, the gentle rhythm of her breathing, the warmth of her body just inches from his. They had changed for bed with awkward modesty, Wyatt stepping outside while Lillian donned her nightgown, then Lillian turning her back as he changed into clean clothes he used for sleeping. "Good night, Wyatt," Lillian whispered in the darkness. "Good night, Lillian," he replied, his voice unexpectedly husky. "Sleep well." As he drifted toward sleep, Wyatt reflected on the strange turn his life had taken. A week ago, he had been a solitary cowboy with no responsibilities beyond his duties to the ranch. Now he was a husband and stepfather, with a family depending on him for protection and support. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, he found himself filled with a quiet determination to be worthy of the trust Lillian had placed in him, and a cautious hope that their practical arrangement might, in time, become something deeper. The first weeks of their marriage established a routine that suited them both. Wyatt rose early for his ranch duties, returning midday for a quick meal when possible, and finishing his work by sundown. Lillian managed the cabin, caring for Emma and preparing meals with increasing confidence as she became familiar with the ranch's rhythms. Their physical relationship developed slowly, beginning with casual touches, a hand on a shoulder, fingers brushing while passing objects, a brief embrace before Wyatt left for work. The first time Wyatt kissed Lillian properly was after he had completed the promised crib for Emma, a sturdy construction of pine with a carved horse decorating the headboard. "It's beautiful, Wyatt," Lillian had exclaimed, running her fingers over the smooth wood. "Where did you learn to do this?" "My father was a carpenter before he turned to farming," Wyatt explained. "He taught me the basics." Her smile of genuine pleasure had drawn him forward, and before he could second-guess himself, he had leaned down to press his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle but lingering, and when they drew apart, the surprise in Lillian's eyes was quickly replaced by warmth. "Thank you," she whispered, and Wyatt wasn't sure if she meant for the crib or the kiss. "You're welcome," he replied, equally ambiguous. That night, they slept closer together in the narrow bed, Wyatt's arm cautiously draped over Lillian's waist. It was a small step, but significant, an acknowledgement of growing feelings that neither was quite ready to name. As summer gave way to autumn, the three of them settled into a family life that increasingly felt natural rather than arranged. Emma thrived in the clean mountain air, growing plumper and more interactive by the day. She recognized Wyatt now, greeting his returns with excited kicks and gurgles that never failed to warm his heart. Lillian, too, blossomed in her new environment. The shadows of fear that had haunted her eyes gradually faded, replaced by a quiet confidence. She made friends with the other ranch wives, particularly Mrs. Henderson, who took a motherly interest in the young family. She even began informal reading lessons for the children of the ranch hands, fulfilling in a small way her dream of teaching. The first time Wyatt heard Emma call him Da, he was mucking out the horse stalls. Lillian had brought the baby to see him during a break, and Emma, now nearly 8 months old and attempting to crawl, had reached for him with chubby hands and uttered the word with perfect clarity. Wyatt had frozen, pitchfork in hand, a lump forming in his throat. Did she just? She's been practicing, Lillian admitted, her eyes shining. I hope you don't mind. I've been showing her your picture and telling her you're her daddy. Wordlessly, Wyatt had set down the pitchfork and taken Emma from Lillian's arms, heedless of his dirty clothes. The baby had patted his stubbled cheek and repeated da with obvious satisfaction. I don't mind, he'd finally managed to say, his voice rough with emotion. I'm honored. That night, after Emma was asleep in her crib, Wyatt and Lillian had come together as husband and wife for the first time, their love-making tender and exploratory, a physical expression of feelings that had been growing steadily between them. I love you, Wyatt had whispered afterward, the words coming naturally in the darkness. I'm not sure when it happened, but I do. Lillian had pressed closer to him, her tears dampening his shoulder. I love you too. I think I started falling for you the moment you picked up Emma in your coat. As winter approached, bringing with it the promise of snow and isolation, Wyatt worried that Lillian might find the ranch too remote, too different from her Eastern upbringing. But she surprised him with her adaptability and genuine appreciation for their simple life. I never thought I could be this happy, she confessed one evening as they sat before the fire, Emma asleep in her crib nearby. In Philadelphia, everything was about appearances, about meeting expectations. Here, there's a freedom to simply be ourselves, even with all the hardships. Wyatt asked, thinking of the blizzard they'd weathered the previous week, the constant physical labor, the lack of conveniences she'd once taken for granted. Especially with the hardships, Lillian replied, snuggling closer to him on the small sofa he'd built for her. They make the good moments sweeter by comparison. As Christmas approached, the first they would celebrate as a family, Wyatt found himself reflecting on the incredible changes the past 6 months had brought. The solitary existence he'd maintained for so long now seemed empty and purposeless compared to the rich family life he shared with Lillian and Emma. Even the threat of Charles Montgomery, which occasionally surfaced in their conversations, seemed distant and less menacing in the face of their happiness. Until the day a stranger rode into the rocking H, asking questions about a woman with a baby. Wyatt was helping repair a fence line when one of the younger ranch hands, Billy, rode up with the news. There's a fella at the main house, talkin' to Mr. Henderson, Billy reported. Eastern type, fancy clothes, says he's lookin' for his wife and child who might have passed this way. A cold dread settled in Wyatt's stomach. Did he give a name? Montgomery, I think. Charles Montgomery. Wyatt was on his horse before Billy finished speaking, racing toward the main house with fear and fury battling for dominance in his mind. His first thought was of Lillian and Emma, alone at the cabin, if Montgomery had already found them. But as he approached the main house, he saw a sleek black horse hitched outside, its eastern saddle and fine tack indicating a wealthy owner who was still inside. Relief mingled with resolve as Wyatt dismounted and strode toward the door, his hand instinctively checking the revolver at his hip. Inside, he found Mr. Henderson seated at his desk, facing a well-dressed man whose back was to the door. The stranger turned at Wyatt's entrance, revealing a handsome face with cold eyes and a mouth set in a permanent sneer. "Ah, here's one of my hands now," Henderson said, his tone carefully neutral though his eyes warned Wyatt to proceed cautiously. "Wyatt, this gentleman is looking for information about travelers who might have passed through our area earlier this year." "Mr. Harmon," the stranger said, extending a gloved hand. "Charles Montgomery of Philadelphia. I understand you might have encountered my wife and child some months ago." Wyatt ignored the outstretched hand, keeping his expression impassive. "A lot of folks pass through these parts. Can't say I recall anyone by that name." Montgomery's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Perhaps I can refresh your memory. My wife, Lillian, a pretty thing with blue eyes and brown hair. She absconded with our infant daughter, Emma, nearly a year ago. I've been searching for them ever since." "Can't help you," Wyatt replied flatly. "If that's all, Mr. Henderson, I should get back to the fence line before dark." "Of course, Wyatt," Henderson nodded, clearly understanding the situation better than he was letting on. "Mr. Montgomery was just leaving. I'm sorry we couldn't be of assistance." Montgomery's pleasant facade slipped slightly, revealing a flash of the anger beneath. "I find it hard to believe no one in this remote area would notice a woman traveling alone with a baby. Perhaps I should speak with some of the other ranch hands or the women. My men are all working and the ladies aren't receiving visitors," Henderson said firmly, standing to indicate the conversation was over. "The nearest town is Clearwater, about 15 miles east. You might try inquiring there." Montgomery's gaze shifted between the two men, calculation evident in his eyes. "I see. Well, thank you for your time, Mr. Henderson." He turned to Wyatt, his smile now openly malicious. "Mr. Harmon, a pleasure. I'm sure we'll meet again." As the door closed behind the unwelcome visitor, Henderson turned to Wyatt. "That's him, isn't it?" "Lillian's husband, former husband," Wyatt corrected grimly. "Legally, she's Mrs. Harmon now. True enough, but you know as well as I do that won't stop a man like that." Henderson moved to the window, watching as Montgomery mounted his horse. "He's heading toward town, not the cabin. That gives you some time." Wyatt nodded, his mind racing. "I need to warn Lillian, get her and Emma somewhere safe." "Take them to the line cabin up by Eagle Creek," Henderson suggested. "It's stocked for winter already and no one would think to look there. I'll send word if Montgomery returns." "Thank you," Wyatt said, gripping the older man's shoulder briefly. "For everything." "Go on," Henderson urged. "And Wyatt, be careful. That man has evil in his eyes." Wyatt rode back to the cabin at a gallop, his mind filled with plans and contingencies. The sight of smoke rising peacefully from the chimney and Lillian hanging laundry outside, Emma playing on a blanket nearby, filled him with both relief and urgency. Lillian looked up at his approach, her smile fading as she registered his expression. "What's wrong?" "Charles is here," Wyatt said without preamble, dismounting and gathering Emma in his arms. "He was at the main house asking questions. Henderson sent him to town, but he'll be back." The color drained from Lillian's face. "How did he find us?" "It doesn't matter now. We need to pack quickly." "Only essentials." Wyatt handed Emma to her, his voice gentling at the fear in her eyes. "It's going to be all right, Lillian. I won't let him take you or Emma." Inside the cabin, they moved with urgent efficiency, gathering warm clothing, food supplies, and the few precious possessions they couldn't bear to leave behind. Emma's crib was too large, but Wyatt carefully packed the carved horse that had adorned it, along with the family Bible where they'd recorded Emma's growth and milestones. As Lillian packed, Wyatt retrieved his rifle from above the door and checked his revolver, ensuring both were loaded and ready. The weapons were a sobering reminder of what might be required to protect his family. "Where will we go?" Lillian asked, securing Emma in a sling across her chest. The line cabin up by Eagle Creek. It's remote, well-stocked and defensible. Wyatt helped her into her coat. Henderson will send word if Charles returns to the ranch. They loaded their supplies onto Copper, and a gentle mare Lillian had learned to ride during the summer. With a last look at the cabin that had become their home, they set off toward the mountains, taking a little used trail that would be difficult to follow. The line cabin was simple but sturdy, built to shelter cowboys during the worst weather when they were working the far boundaries of the ranch. It consisted of a single room with a stone fireplace, a rough table and chairs, 2 bunks built into the wall, and basic supplies stored in crates and hanging from the rafters. "It's not much," Wyatt apologized as he lit the fire, the familiar echo of his words when he'd first brought Lillian to their cabin not lost on either of them. "It's enough," Lillian replied, settling Emma on a blanket near the growing warmth. "As long as we're together." The simplicity of her statement and the trust it implied strengthened Wyatt's resolve. They would weather this storm as they had others together. As night fell, they ate a simple meal and prepared for bed, arranging the bunks so that Emma could sleep safely between them. The baby, sensing the tension, was fussier than usual, and it took longer than normal for her to settle. "What will we do if he finds us?" Lillian asked softly after Emma had finally fallen asleep, her small face peaceful in the firelight. Wyatt's hand found hers in the darkness. "He won't take you from me, either of you." "But legally, he might have a claim." "Not anymore," Wyatt interrupted firmly. "You're my wife now, and Emma is my daughter in every way that matters. The law out here is simpler than back east. A man protects what's his." The fierce protectiveness in his voice both comforted and concerned Lillian. "I don't want you to have to kill for us, Wyatt." "I pray it doesn't come to that," he replied honestly, "but I can't promise it won't." They fell silent, each lost in their own thoughts as the fire crackled and wind whistled around the cabin's sturdy walls. Eventually, Lillian's breathing deepened in sleep, her hand still clasped in Wyatt's. He remained awake, listening to the night sounds and planning for all possibilities. 3 days passed in tense waiting. Wyatt ventured out only to check on the horses and gather more firewood, always with his rifle at the ready. On the 4th morning, as they were finishing a breakfast of cornmeal mush and dried apples, the sound of approaching hooves brought them both to alert stillness. "Stay inside," Wyatt ordered, checking his revolver before moving to the window. Through the small, grimy pane, he could make out 2 riders approaching, one on the familiar dappled mare ridden by Billy, the youngest ranch hand, and the other on Charles Montgomery's sleek black horse. "It's Billy," Wyatt reported, his stomach tightening. "And Montgomery." Lillian gasped, instinctively gathering Emma closer. "How did they find us?" "I don't know." Wyatt positioned himself by the door, revolver ready, but Billy wouldn't have led him here willingly. "Stay back, away from the windows." As the riders drew closer, Wyatt could see that Billy's face was bruised, one eye swollen shut. The young cowboy's hands were tied to the saddle horn, and Montgomery held the reins of both horses. "Harmon," Montgomery called out, halting about 20 yards from the cabin. "I know you're in there with my wife and child. Send them out, and perhaps we can resolve this matter peacefully." Wyatt opened the door just enough to make himself visible while keeping his body shielded. "Let the boy go, Montgomery. He has nothing to do with this." "On the contrary, he was most helpful in locating this charming retreat," Montgomery replied with mock pleasantness. "After some persuasion, of course." Wyatt's jaw tightened at the implications. "What do you want?" "What's rightfully mine," Montgomery's voice hardened. "My wife and daughter. Return them to me and you can keep your miserable life." "They're not yours anymore," Wyatt stated firmly. Lillian is my wife now, legally married before witnesses. Emma is my daughter. Montgomery's laugh was cold and humorless. A frontier marriage to a runaway wife is hardly binding, Harmon. I have the law on my side, Eastern law, which takes precedence over your barbarian customs. Not out here, it doesn't. Wyatt raised his revolver, aiming deliberately at Montgomery. Let the boy go and ride away while you still can. Instead of backing down, Montgomery pulled his own pistol, pressing it against Billy's temple. Perhaps this will convince you of my sincerity. Send out Lillian and the child, or the boy dies. His blood will be on your hands. Behind Wyatt, Lillian made a small sound of distress. I can't let him kill Billy because of me, she whispered. He's bluffing, Wyatt replied, though uncertainty gnawed at him. The cold calculation in Montgomery's eyes suggested a man capable of any cruelty to get what he wanted. You have 1 minute to decide, Montgomery called out. After that, I start shooting. First the boy, then you. Lillian and Emma will still be mine, but with far less pleasant circumstances. The threat to his family ignited a rage in Wyatt that cleared his mind of all uncertainty. With deliberate calm, he fully opened the cabin door, stepping onto the porch with his revolver trained on Montgomery. Let him go, Wyatt repeated, his voice deadly quiet. Your quarrel is with me. Montgomery's smirk faltered slightly at Wyatt's steady advance. Stay where you are, or the boy dies. In that moment, Billy made his move. Despite his bound hands, the young cowboy threw himself sideways, unbalancing Montgomery and causing his shot to go wild. The distraction was all Wyatt needed. His first bullet struck Montgomery's shoulder, spinning him backward off his horse. The second hit the man's gun hand as he attempted to regain his aim. Montgomery screamed in pain and rage, his pistol falling to the ground as he clutched his bleeding hand. Wyatt was on him in moments, dragging him away from the horses and throwing him face down in the dirt. Billy, are you hurt? Wyatt called, keeping his boot firmly planted on Montgomery's back. Just these damn ropes and some bruises, Billy replied, struggling to free himself now that his horse had calmed. He jumped me when I was checking the north pasture, made me tell him about the line cabins. Not your fault, Wyatt assured him, using his free hand to cut Montgomery's belt and fashion a rough binding for the man's wrists. Lillian, bring me some rope from inside, please. Lillian emerged cautiously, Emma held tightly in her arms. Her face paled at the sight of her former husband bleeding on the ground, but her steps were steady as she brought Wyatt the requested rope. Will he live? She asked, keeping her distance. Unfortunately, Wyatt replied grimly, securing Montgomery's wrists behind his back. The wounds aren't fatal, just painful. Montgomery twisted his head to glare at Lillian, his handsome face contorted with hatred. You'll regret this, Lillian, both of you. My father has connections, judges, marshals. You won't escape punishment. Shut up, Wyatt growled, tightening the ropes deliberately. To Billy, who had managed to free himself and was now approaching, he added, Ride back to the ranch. Tell Henderson what happened and that we're bringing Montgomery in to the sheriff in Clearwater. Billy nodded, glancing warily at the bound man. You sure you don't want me to stay and help? We'll be fine, Wyatt assured him. But send someone ahead to alert Sheriff Davis about the situation. As Billy rode off, Wyatt hauled Montgomery to his feet. The Eastern man swayed, pale from pain and blood loss. You need to bandage these wounds, he demanded. I could bleed to death. You should have thought of that before threatening my family, Wyatt replied coldly. Nevertheless, he nodded to Lillian. Bring me some cloth for bandages. I don't want him dying before he faces justice. While Lillian went back into the cabin, Wyatt leaned close to Montgomery, his voice pitched low so only the other man could hear. If you ever come near my wife or daughter again, I will kill you. That's not a threat, it's a promise. There are 100 places in these mountains where a body would never be found. The fear that flashed in Montgomery's eyes gave Wyatt grim satisfaction. The man was a bully, and like most bullies, he crumbled when faced with someone who wouldn't back down. Lillian returned with strips of cloth, her expression resolute as she handed them to Wyatt. "Emma is inside, sleeping," she reported. "I've packed our things. We can leave as soon as you're ready." Wyatt nodded, quickly bandaging Montgomery's shoulder and hand not gently but effectively enough to stop the bleeding. "Can you ride?" he asked Lillian. "Yes," she replied without hesitation. "I'll take Emma with me." The journey to Clearwater took most of the day, with Montgomery mounted on his own horse, his hands tied to the saddle horn much as Billy's had been. Wyatt rode behind him, revolver ready, while Lillian followed with Emma secured in the sling across her chest. Sheriff Davis was waiting for them at the edge of town, alerted by the rider Henderson had sent ahead. "Got your message," the grizzled lawman said, eyeing Montgomery with professional assessment. "This the fella causing trouble, Charles Montgomery from Philadelphia," Wyatt confirmed. "Kidnapped and beat one of the Rocking H hands, then threatened my wife and child at gunpoint." "Lies," Montgomery spat. "This man stole my wife and daughter. I was merely reclaiming what's legally mine." Sheriff Davis raised an eyebrow. "That true, madam?" he asked Lillian directly. Lillian straightened in her saddle, meeting the sheriff's gaze steadily. "I left Charles because he was violent and abusive. I feared for my life and my daughter's safety. Wyatt Harmon saved us when we were stranded on the prairie, and later became my husband in a legal ceremony performed by Reverend Thomas in this very town." The sheriff nodded slowly. "Reverend Thomas mentioned something about that when your man's message came through. Said it was all properly done, witnesses and documentation." He turned back to Montgomery. "Seems to me the lady has made her choice, and it's a legal one by territorial law. This is absurd." Montgomery struggled against his bonds. "I demand you arrest this man for shooting me and release my wife into my custody immediately." "Ain't gonna happen," Sheriff Davis replied calmly. "What is gonna happen is you're spending the night in my jail while I sort this out. Shooting you while you were threatening folks with a gun ain't a crime in these parts, it's common sense." As two deputies helped the protesting Montgomery down from his horse and toward the jailhouse, the sheriff turned back to Wyatt and Lillian. "You two should get a room at the hotel tonight. I'll need statements from both of you in the morning, and then we can figure out what charges this fella's facing." Wyatt nodded his thanks, relief beginning to replace the tension that had kept him vigilant throughout the long ride. What about his claims about Eastern law taking precedence? Sheriff Davis snorted. "Dakota Territory has its own laws, and they recognize legal marriages performed here. Besides, from what I hear, Eastern courts are starting to take a dimmer view of husbands who beat their wives. Between that and the charges he's facing for what he did to your ranch hand, Mr. Montgomery's going to have more pressing concerns than pursuing custody claims." That night, in the relative luxury of Clearwater's small hotel, Wyatt and Lillian finally allowed themselves to believe the danger might truly be past. Emma, exhausted from the journey, slept soundly in a dresser drawer lined with blankets, a familiar makeshift cradle that reminded them of their first days together. "You think it's really over?" Lillian asked as they lay side by side in the hotel bed, her head resting on Wyatt's shoulder. "Not entirely," Wyatt answered honestly. "Men like Montgomery don't give up easily, but he'll face charges here first, and that gives us time." "Time for what?" "Time to establish ourselves more permanently, maybe buy some land of our own, somewhere Charles would never think to look." Wyatt had been considering this possibility for some time, weighing options and opportunities. Henderson mentioned that old Jim Blackwell is looking to sell his place over by Willow Creek, good water, decent grazing land, and a solid house already built. Lillian raised herself on one elbow to look at him. "You want to have your own ranch." "Our own ranch," Wyatt corrected. "I've saved most of my wages over the years. It wouldn't be a grand spread, but it would be ours, free and clear. A place where Emma could grow up safe, where you could maybe start that school you've always wanted." "Oh, Wyatt." Tears filled Lillian's eyes, but they were tears of joy, not sorrow. "I never dared dream of such a future." "Is that a yes?" he asked, smiling up at her. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." She leaned down to kiss him, pouring all her love and hope into the gesture. As Wyatt held his wife close, his gaze drifted to the sleeping baby nearby, the child who had brought them together, whose cries of hunger in the prairie grass had changed the course of his solitary life forever. From reluctant rescuer to devoted husband and father, his journey had been unexpected but infinitely rewarding. Tomorrow would bring challenges, Montgomery's hearing, legal statements, decisions about their future. But tonight, in this quiet room with the two people he loved most in the world, Wyatt Harmon knew with absolute certainty that he had found what many men search for their entire lives and never find. Not just a family, but a true home. Spring came to the Dakota Territory in a riot of wildflowers and new growth, transforming the landscape much as the past year had transformed the lives of Wyatt and Lillian Harmon. The cabin on their newly purchased ranch near Willow Creek was larger than their previous home, with 2 proper bedrooms, a spacious kitchen, and a front porch where Lillian often sat in the evenings, watching Emma take her first tottering steps in the yard. Charles Montgomery had been sentenced to 3 years in the territorial prison for the assault on Billy and the threats against Wyatt and Lillian. His father's connections had proven less influential than he'd boasted, particularly when several witnesses from Philadelphia had come forward with their own accounts of his violent behavior. The judge had made it clear that upon his release, Montgomery would face additional charges if he ever approached the Harmon family again. The ranch was small by Dakota standards, just enough land to support a modest herd of cattle, and the horses Wyatt had begun breeding as a secondary business. But it was theirs, paid for with Wyatt's savings and worked with his own hands, with occasional help from a young cowhand they'd hired from the nearby Lakota reservation. Lillian had indeed started a small school, converting an unused storage building into a classroom where she taught the children from neighboring ranches and the reservation. Her gentle manner and genuine interest in her students quickly earned her the respect of families throughout the area. Emma, now walking and beginning to form simple sentences, had her father's quiet strength and her mother's compassionate heart. At 18 months old, she was the center of the Harmon household, her laughter and curiosity a constant reminder of how much they had to be thankful for. On a warm June evening, as they sat together on the porch watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant hues of orange and purple, Lillian turned to Wyatt with a smile that held a special secret. "I have news," she said softly, taking his hand and placing it gently on her stomach. "Come winter, Emma will have a little brother or sister." Wyatt's eyes widened, then crinkled with joy as he pulled her into a gentle embrace. "Are you sure?" "Dr. Harrison confirmed it yesterday when I was in town," Lillian replied, her eyes shining. "He says everything looks perfect." "Just like our family," Wyatt murmured, kissing her tenderly. As if on cue, Emma tottered over from where she had been examining a particularly fascinating dandelion. "Up da da," she demanded, raising her arms imperiously. Laughing, Wyatt swung her into his arms, settling her between himself and Lillian. "What do you think about being a big sister, Emma girl?" he asked, though he knew she couldn't possibly understand the question. Emma's response was to pat her mother's stomach and declare, "Baby," with surprising clarity, causing both adults to stare at her in astonishment. "How did she know?" Wyatt whispered. Lillian shook her head, equally amazed. "Children sense things we don't understand, or perhaps she just heard me talking to Martha Henderson about it." Whatever the explanation, Emma's apparent approval of the coming addition to their family added to their joy. As darkness fell and stars began to appear in the vast Dakota sky, Wyatt reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. From a solitary cowboy riding the lonely prairie to a husband, father, and rancher with deep roots in the land and community, his transformation had been complete. All because he had stopped to investigate a baby's cry in the tall grass, a simple act of compassion that had led to the greatest blessings of his life. "What are you thinking about?" Lillian asked, noticing his contemplative expression. "How lucky I am," Wyatt replied honestly. "How different my life would be if I hadn't heard Emma crying that day. Or if you had ridden on, as many would have," Lillian added softly. "Some might call it chance, but I believe it was Providence that brought you to us." "Providence, chance, or destiny, I'm just grateful it happened," Wyatt said, tightening his arm around her shoulders. "And I intend to spend the rest of my life proving worthy of the gift I've been given." Emma, drowsy now in the growing darkness, leaned her head against her father's chest with complete trust. Lillian rested her head on his shoulder, her hand protectively covering the new life growing within her. And Wyatt Harmon, once the loneliest man on the Dakota prairie, held his family close, his heart full to overflowing with a love he had never thought to find, a love born from a baby's cry, and a simple act of human kindness on a summer day, now forever woven into the fabric of their shared life.